yeah, I would like to introduce Aurélien Saussay, who is currently assistant professor at the London School of Economics within the Grantham Research Institute, the LSE's research center that is actually dedicated to climate change studies. And he's also associate researcher at the OFCE, the French Observatory for Economic Conjuncture. We leave the floor to Aurélien, and we apologize for this technical problems. My screen is very small, so I'm trying to share, but it's a bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's unfortunate that there have been any technical mishap. Perfect.
So is it okay if we stay like this on this format, or do you want to?
It would be really better to go full screen, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Comment?
Mode plein écran, mode plein écran.
Où ça?
Juste en dessous. Un coup, un peu en dessous, un peu en dessous. Non, c'était dedans. Descends, voilà là-dessus.
Is it okay?
Brilliant, thanks.
And we really apologize for all this. So Aurélien, the floor is yours. What we can just do is that you, let me know.
I'll just tell you. So thanks everyone for your invitation. Really sorry about this mishap with the screen sharing. So this paper essentially originated from a desire to better characterize green jobs. This is a word that is, or a term that is very often used both by policymakers and researchers alike. And the actual content or definition behind that word is usually a bit fuzzy. So what I wanted to do is really to try to get into the details of what that notion covered. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So one thing that's really difficult with low carbon jobs compared to their dirty counterparts, so to speak, is that they are really widespread across the economy. They're quite diffuse across both sectors, occupations, geographies. We're also talking about emerging occupations. So these are not well-identified jobs that have been around for decades. And that leads to fuzziness both in terms of the definition, but also in terms of data sources that could help identify them. And by contrast, if we look at dirty jobs, we have very well identified, so by dirty, I'll mean like fossil fuel intensive or carbon intensive in this context. We have very well identified industries, well identified professions. So the outcome of that is that on the one hand, we have jobs that we know are threatened by the transition to a decarbonized economy that are well identified and thus quite visible, both to policymakers and in the policy debate. And we know that they are going to be phased out as we move towards a decarbonized economy. But on the other hand, jobs that will be created through decarbonization are less visible. And that emphasizes the job killing argument against strong action towards decarbonization in the policy debate because of the risk of job destruction, but that also de-emphasizes how much job creation there might be with the low carbon transition. So if we move to the next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So there's at this stage no agreed definition yet regarding green jobs or green skills. The earliest forays into that line of research initially looked at sectors, but it was very early on obvious that that would be too broad a brush to really paint that picture because very few sectors can be completely considered as green, and then the partial greenness of the sector is really hard to measure. So should we measure it at the firm level or by activities or even at the worker level? Like, are we talking about occupation? Are we talking about positions within firms? So all of these need to be better identified. And so the tack we take in this paper is that to achieve a working definition of what a green job is, we need to look at the skill set that's required for a particular position and try to find which skill sets are commensurate with green or low carbon jobs. So one point on terminology, throughout the presentation, I will be using green and low carbon interchangeably. So the advantage of focusing on green skills is that we'll be able, through that, to compare the skill set of low carbon jobs and non-low carbon jobs. So evaluate what skill gap there may exist for workers to shift into those newly created green jobs, if any, because of course, if there's a skill gap, there's also a need for retraining, and that might increase the cost of transitioning to a low carbon economy. And so that would have important policy implications in terms of the need for complementary educational policies to retrain those workers that will lose their jobs in fossil fuel intensive industries. So let's get to it. Thanks. So the initial contributions in that literature were focused on using a task-driven approach. So that's been in particular the work of my co-author Francesco Bona, who essentially took advantage of the ONET dataset. So the ONET classification is a classification of all occupations in the American economy and American labor force. And for each of these occupations, the ONET classification lists a set of tasks, so both non-specific and specific tasks. So non-specific tasks are generic tasks like problem solving or math ability or time management, and specific tasks are more specific as the name implied to the occupation under consideration. And from 2009 onwards, they've also distinguished a subset of tasks as green, specific tasks as green. And so that allowed Francesco and his co-authors to define an index of greenness at the occupation level by calculating the share of green specific tasks over the total number of specific tasks. So using this first approach, which again, it's at the occupation level, allowed to derive a set of first results. If we get to the next slide. That's not the next slide. That's all the way to the end.
I'm really sorry. I have also issue with my own screen. Oh, I'm really sorry.
Okay, we just need to get back to slide 5.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know.
So essentially, those first results were that we know that green occupations require a bit more training and less non-routine cognitive, more non-routine cognitive tasks, so less routine tasks than non-green occupation. That when you look at the skills that are more in demand, they require more technical, engineering, monitoring, and managerial skills. And that some professions are, at least according to those first contributions, that were winners included technicians and engineers, and workers were more on the losers side. But we'll see in the course of this presentation that that's not really in agreement with our own findings. And finally, in a paper looking at the impact of the American Reconstruction Act on the creation of jobs, particularly the green portion of the American Reconstruction Act and its impact on the local labor market, David Popp and Francesco and Giovanni Marini showed that essentially the effectiveness of green subsidies to lead to the creation of green jobs depended strongly on the local availability of green skills. So that for green subsidies to lead to green jobs, you need the right skill sets in the labor pool where you were injecting those subsidies. However, despite those promising first results, using ONET limits yourself to looking at green jobs at the occupation level, meaning that you can't really look at within occupation variability. And that's actually a strong limitation, because despite how detailed the ONET classification is, there's like more than 800 occupations distinguished in the ONET classification. In practice, if you look at the most detailed level, you get to something like, for example, chemical engineer, which is an occupation that I will use an example throughout the presentation. And a chemical engineer, if they work in, let's say, the petrochemical industry, would definitely be considered a fossil-intensive or dirty job, while conversely, if they work to improve the yields of solar panels or to improve insulation material, that would definitely be a job contributing to decarbonization, so be a green or low carbon job. And for most chemical engineers, they're neither dirty nor green. And that variation, those comparisons that help characterize precisely what low carbon jobs are missed with occupation level information. The other limitation is that this list of green tasks was established in 2009-2010 and hasn't been updated since then. So these are very costly data set put together, so they're updated infrequently. And so to get more granularity in the analysis, to get within occupation variance, and to get a more up-to-date set of information, we had to move to something else. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see what that something else is. So essentially, again, the idea is to move from comparing how green two occupations are to looking within an occupation at comparing the green variant and the non-green variant of the same occupation. And that also has important implications or relevance, rather, for the debate on the need for training, because if you lose your job in a fossil-intensive sector, the likelihood that you're going to switch to another job is higher if you switch to your same occupation, just a non-green, a non-dirty variant of that occupation. So, for example, if you lose your job as a petrochemical engineer, you're probably going to look for a job as a chemical engineer elsewhere. You're not going to try to become, landscaping architect, even though there might be more landscaping architects thanks to the green transition. So that within occupation variance, that's really key to understand these mechanisms. If we get to the next slide, thanks. So essentially, the approach we choose is to look at skill set based, a skill based approach, and for that we use job level data, in particular job advertisement level data. So the big advantage of that is that we will have lots of different job ads per occupation. So we have a lot of variance within occupation. And for that, we make use of a data set provided by a private company called Lightcast that used to be called Burning Glass, and its data set has been used a number of times over the past 3 to 4 years in the labor economics literature in particular, under the name Burning Glass. And so it's quite a massive data set. It encompasses essentially what they do is that they scrape all online jobs advertisement websites in the United States. So for the US, it's like 40,000 different online sources of job ads. And here we use the entire data set from 2010 to 2019. So that's close to 200 million job ads. And for each of these, we will observe the occupation, of course. Crucially, what Lightcast also provides is that so they get the whole text, the whole textual description of the position advertised, and they run a natural language processing algorithm on top of it to extract a set of keywords, if you will, that they call skills. In practice, you'll see that it's a mix of skills and tasks. Sometimes it's even technologies. But one good way to think about this as job identifiers. So these are phrases that are identifying the skill sets required by the employer to fulfill that particular position being advertised. And for some, a subset, unfortunately, only of the data set, we also observe the salary offered and the educational and experience requirements. And again, the advantage is that so yeah, like we can stick to that next slide. It's just going to re-insist on the fact that we want to look at transition within the same occupational group. So we contribute to, as always, 3 different strands of the literature. Of course, first and foremost, obviously, the identification of green jobs. So as I was mentioning, there's been previous work on that using the ONE classification at the occupation level. There's one recent working paper in the NBR last year by Curtis Marinescu that is probably the closest to our own work, where they also use Lightcast data, but only to characterize renewable jobs in the solar and wind power sector, while we try to get to an identification of low carbon jobs that is much broader. We also relate to the literature on the impact of environmental policies on the labor market and on employment, and also the techniques we are using the skills-based approach that relates to the literature on the adjustments of the labor market to technical change, particularly to automation and the impact of the IT revolution on the labor market. The papers listed here were using very similar data and similar approaches to achieve their results. So now moving on to the Lightcast dataset. So in practice, as I was saying, a very large dataset, 200 million ads, but the volume of ads, of jobs being advertised online, and the coverage of Lightcast has increased over the period. So we observe more ads towards the end of the period than the beginning of the period. Has roughly doubled over the period. That's one thing to keep in mind as we proceed. If we get to the next slide, please.
Sorry.
Thanks. So in terms of how the breakdown by occupation looks like. So this is the like 2-digit level groupings in the SOC, the Standard Occupation Classifications. That's the, as the name implies, the main occupation classification used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States. One thing that is really practical in that classification is that essentially anything under the double-digit 30 is considered high skilled, and everything above double-digit 30 is considered low skilled. So this is terminology I will be using in the rest of the presentation. High skilled and low skilled, that's what I'm referring to, essentially the first half of this set of occupation versus the latter half of it above number 30. So as expected, high skill occupations are overrepresented in an online job ad dataset, because as you can imagine, some occupations are more prone to advertise their positions online than others. And so to check that, we compared the breakdown by occupation in the Lightcast dataset versus the breakdown in the actual labor force of each of these occupations. And so without surprise, high skill occupations, particularly IT occupation, as you can see in computer and mathematical occupations, are way overrepresented in the dataset of online job ads. And conversely, low skill occupations such as construction workers are way less represented in the dataset. However, one thing I'd like to attract attention to is that even for underrepresented occupations like construction and extraction, for example, we still have millions of job ads in the dataset because of how large the aggregate dataset is. And in practice, this lack of representativity at the aggregate level is only relevant when we do compute metrics at the aggregate level precisely. Whereas within each of these occupational groups, the Burning Glass dataset is fairly representative in practice. Thanks. So looking at an ad itself, so what do we actually observe? Again, taking an example here that would be a chemical engineer. So here we observe that this position is offered in Sunnyvale in California. We know when it has been offered in 2018, and it's particularly comprehensive observation because we also know what the level of education required was. So it required an MSc, with a number of years of experience required, and we also know the starting salary here, in this case, $118,000. But crucially, the way we characterize that particular position is with this vector, or this set of skills. Again, one way to think about those as job identifiers. So as you can see, it ranges from generic skills like project management to much more specific skills like Six Sigma production processes, to things that are essentially technologies like fuel cell. And so of these like job identifiers as skills, Burning Glass or Lightcast extracts 16,000 distinct skills across its entire data set of 200 million ads. So the first step in the methodology we developed is that we needed some way to classify each of these 16,000 distinct skills between low carbon skills and non-low carbon skills. And to do that, we decided to apply natural language processing and a combination with expert elicitation to identify these green skills. So one last word about this vector of skills. One thing that is very important to remember is that the length of that skill vector is quite heterogeneous. Of course, between occupation, we would expect that because we would expect low skill occupation to have fewer skills than high skill occupations. And that's what we see here. Architecture and engineering, or life, physical, and social sciences, which are high skill, are described with more skills than in construction and extraction or installation, maintenance, and repair. But even within occupation, there's a lot of heterogeneity too. So as you can see, between the bottom decile and the top vintile or twentile, essentially you have a gap, a factor of 1 to 5 amongst high skill occupations. So we've had conversations with Lightcast, try to understand better that heterogeneity. And in practice, what's happening is that first, different firms, different employers have different ways to describe and specify their positions. So some will be more detailed than others. And the other point is that the venue on which the ad is published will also determine how much text or how much room there is to describe the particular occupation. So in practice, some websites only give you a single paragraph, while others have no length, have no limits on how long your ad can be. And in that case, of course, there will be way more source text for the NLP algorithm of Lightcast to extract distinct skills to describe the position. So just the takeaway from this is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the skill vector that is not necessarily always meaningful in how the occupation being advertised being different from another, except when you compare between occupations. Okay, we can get to the next slide, please. Thanks. So let's get to our main methodological contribution, this algorithm to identify core low carbon skills. So we wanted to identify skills that are characteristic of low carbon occupations, and we call these skills core low carbon skills. So the first thing we needed for that is to get a set of low carbon keywords, and we wanted to have as little human intervention or supervision in machine learning term in our algorithm as possible. So we first needed to obtain a source of textual data from which we could have extracted low carbon keywords. So what we did to then is to get back to the owner classification, get through the list of green tasks, get the subset of these green tasks that are in climate-related groupings. And for each of these tasks, the owner classification provides a sentence or 2 sentences to describe that task. So I've put like a few examples on the slide here, like calculate potential for energy savings, or fabricate prototypes of fuel cell components, acid laser systems. And essentially, what we did was to contrast those green tasks with the textual description of non-green tasks, and by applying a NLP algorithm called TF-IDF, so text frequency inverse document frequency, we can tease out those keywords, so both monograms and bigrams, that are the most characteristic of the green tasks in the owner classification. And then we did something very similar for green products in the Prodcom classification. And so out of that, we get our list of low carbon keywords. And then we need some way to match these low carbon keywords to the skills in the Lightcast dataset. So we could have done a simple fuzzy matching, but we wanted to do something a bit better because the vocabulary used in ONET and the vocabulary used in those job adverts was not necessarily that similar. So to alleviate that potential issue, we applied what's called semantic matching. So we used word embeddings, where essentially each word or each diagram can be represented as a point in a high dimensional space. And when you take generalized cosine between 2 of these vectors in the high dimensional space, the generalized cosine is a measure of how semantically close those two words or two diagrams actually are. So by doing that, by calculating those semantic distances between the low carbon keywords we had extracted in the first step and the skills in the lightcast dataset, for each of the 16,000 skills, we get a so-called greenness score that ranges between 0 and 1, with 1 being a perfect match against one of our low carbon keywords, and 0 being a complete lack of semantic relationship between the low carbon keyword and the skill. And so at this step, we had almost 400 skills, so 396 skills that had a perfect match with one of our top 20 low carbon keywords. So at that stage, we get those 396 skills and label them as our first core low carbon skills. Then we had 15,000 that's called 0. So these are out. But then we had 600 skills remaining that were in a fuzzy zone, so to speak, that were neither 0 nor 1, that were in between. And that part needed manual inspection to reclassify those that were in this gray zone between low carbon and non-low carbon. And so essentially, that gets the supervised portion of our selection algorithm. So far, it's been completely machine driven and completely unsupervised. At this stage, from this stage onwards, it becomes supervised. And so to do that supervised portion, we conducted an expert survey across colleagues at LSE, Oxford, the OECD, University of Venice, amongst others, to review 600 high scoring skills. And out of these 600 skills that were in the gray zone, 51 skills were ultimately selected by this expert review. So in the final analysis, in the next slide, we get a Miriam, in the next slide, please. Thanks. So we get a total of 450 skills that are low carbon. And so I think we've skipped a slide, unfortunately. Thanks. So we get 447 low carbon skills that are core low carbon. And so to give you an idea of where these are, a lot of them are technology related, like solar energy or wind energy related. Others are like related to something broader, or like a sector or a transportation mode, like light rail transit. Others yet are related to policies like the Clean Air Act in the US. And so essentially at this stage, we have for each of the 16,000 skills, classify them as either low carbon for 447 of them, or generic or non-low carbon related. So once we have these, we can now classify job ads as low carbon or not, and that's in the next slide. So if we get back to our chemical engineer example, remember the set of skills. We have these 12 skills describing this particular position. And so in there, one of the skills is a low carbon skill, fuel cell. And so our definition is that if the skill set describing a position contains at least one low carbon skill, then we classify the position as low carbon. So the reason why we do this in a kind of like either or situation at the job ad level is, again, because of the heterogeneity in the skill vector length. Initially, we wanted to have a kind of intensity metric to on top of this extensive metric, but the problem is the proportion of green skills does not necessarily bear any information because of how heterogeneous the skill vector length actually is. So now we're ready to move on to results. Absolutely. So if we get to the next slide. Thanks. So the first thing we've looked at is the evolution of the share of low carbon jobs in the economy across the period of observation, across the past decade. So essentially, the first thing to note is that that share is relatively low. It remained relatively constant to around 1.5% of the entire volume of positions offered, and it hasn't increased over the period. Initially, that was a bit surprising to us, but actually, when we think back on it, this half of this period actually coincides with the Trump administration. And generally speaking, the 2010s have not been a period of strong federal level climate policy interventions in the US. The other interesting finding in here is that there's a higher share of low carbon jobs amongst low skilled occupations and high skilled occupations. And actually, so it's a bit muted by the scale here, but also in terms of trends, the share of low skill occupation is trending up, while the share of high skill occupation is trending down over the period. And in practice, that also surprised us initially, but it actually jives really well with another finding in the climate economics literature, which is the fact that the share of low carbon patents has also been trending down over the period. So it is compatible with the interpretation that we are moving past the most R&D intensive phase of the low carbon transition and into the implementation phase of the low carbon transition. And that phase actually requires a lot more low skilled occupations and high skilled occupations. If you look at like the main components of decarbonization scenarios, if we look at installing new renewable energy production capacity, that's mostly construction workers, installation and maintenance worker, and operations workers afterwards, so all low skilled. If you look at energy retrofits, that's all construction workers, again, low skilled. If you look at public transportation deployment, driving and operating public transportation networks, or building new public transportation infrastructure, again, all low skilled. So it does make sense that as we progress through the implementation of the low carbon transition, we get more growth on the low skilled end of the spectrum than the high skilled end of the spectrum. And we can get to the next slide. So now if we look at where those low carbon ads are concentrated in terms of occupational groups, we have 6 groups that are really highlighted. On the high skilled side, business and financial operations, so essentially executives, architecture and engineering, again, no surprises there. Life, physical and social science. So I have to admit, unfortunately, it's mostly physical science. There's not much climate related or low carbon related social scientists in the data set. On the low scale side, construction and extraction workers, mostly construction, of course, installation, maintenance and repair, and the transportation sector. Now, if we look in detail at the trends within those high low carbon occupations, we see first that for most of them, it's been relatively flat too over the period, with some discrepancies, but also that even in the most green of these occupations, the overall share is still relatively low. For most of them, it oscillates around 5%, between 3 and 5%. And for the most green, physical scientists and transportation, it goes up to 8%, but that's pretty much it. So it never gets beyond 10% for any of those occupational groups. So, as I was saying, one of the main advantages of our approach is that we can contrast the skill sets of the green version and the non-green versions of the same occupation. So the way we do that is that we look at 5 skill groups here: cognitive, IT skills, management skills, social skills, and technical skills. So these groups are taken from the labor econ literature. And for each of these, we look at whether like the share of job ads that contain at least 1 or 2 or more of each of these skill groups. So the way to read this chart is, for example, if we look at business operations specialists, then the generic version of job ads for business operations specialists would 25% of them would contain exactly 1 cognitive skills, and 10% would contain 2 or more cognitive skills. Whereas if we look at the low carbon version of business operations specialist, then 26% of the ads for low carbon business operations specialists would contain a cognitive skill, and 11% would contain 2 or more cognitive skills. So the interpretation from that is that the low carbon version of a business operations specialist is one more intensive in cognitive skills, both at the extensive margin and the intensive margin. And so that way, we get a very synthetic way of characterizing the skill gap between versions of the same occupation, whether it be generic, low carbon, and in the case of engineers, we can also look at high carbon engineers. And so in terms of overall findings, the first one is that this skills gap is quite heterogeneous across skill groups. On average, low carbon jobs tend to be more skill intensive than generic jobs. And if we look at the skill groups that are more represented, we find management, technical, and social skills being more required for low carbon jobs than for generic jobs. The other thing that's interesting is that if we compare the distance between high carbon and generic versus the distance between low carbon and generic, actually both of these are in roughly the same direction, and low carbon and high carbon job are closer to one another than they are respectively to generic jobs. And that's also true if we go to the next slide for low skill occupations. So of course, in low skill occupations, we have way fewer skills in the ads overall. So that explains why the metrics are so much lower as expected. But you'll see for construction and extraction workers that actually green construction workers and high carbon extraction workers actually have skill sets that are quite similar and are more similar between one another than generic construction and extraction workers. So another thing we wanted to look at is when we look at the skills that are associated with low carbon jobs. So not the skills that define low carbon jobs, so not the core low carbon skills, but skills that come with them that are more prevalent in low carbon jobs. Wanted to know whether these skills were like characteristic of the particular occupation under consideration, in which case we're looking at a specialization story to get towards the green version of your occupation. You need to strengthen the skills that are already characteristic of your occupation. Or conversely, if we're looking at a diversification story, whereby you would need to acquire skills that are outside of your normal skill set. So to measure that, we define two indices. First, a green, like a greenness index, a skill greenness index. So essentially that looks at how prevalent a given skill is in the green version of an occupation versus the non-green version of an occupation. And then we also define a coreness skill index. So that coreness index defines how core a particular skill is to the occupation. So it looks at how prevalent that skill is for the given occupation compared to the entire labor force. So now if we move to the next slide to look at this graphically. So on these charts, each dot is an individual skill. On the x-axis, you have how core a skill is to a particular occupation. So to the right, you'll have skills that are more characteristic, for example, for the first graph of engineers. And to the left, you'll have skills that are less characteristic of engineers, meaning skills that appear less for engineers than for other occupations. And on the y-axis, you have the low carbon coreness or greenness. And that measures how characteristic that same skill, like the same dot, is for green engineers compared to all engineers. And essentially here in this case, the fact that we find a positive correlation means that on average, skills that are more characteristic of engineers are also skills that are more prevalent for green engineers. So to move to being a green engineer as an engineer, the skills you need to strengthen are those that are already in your skill set. You see the same thing for high carbon engineers, but conversely, if we look, for example, at business operations specialists, we have a negative correlation this time, which means that green skills for green business operations specialists are outside of their normal skill set, and that to move towards the green version of their occupation, to become a green business operations specialist, then you need to acquire skills that are outside your normal skill set. And you also see that for most other occupations, we do not find a positive nor a negative correlation, which means that there's neither a specialization nor a diversification story to be told in those instances. So if we get to, thanks. Another big one that we wanted to look at was the potential existence of a green wage premium. So as you're probably familiar with, this is an argument that's often being made that the low carbon transition is going to create a lot of well-paying jobs. So here we are the first to be able to look at whether the green version of an occupation is better paid than the non-green version of that occupation. And so for each of these, the bottom estimates, so the one with the little round dot, relates to the first part of our period of observation from 2010 to 2012. And the top estimate, the one with the triangle, relates to the latter part of our estimate range, so 2017 to 2019. And what we see for almost all occupations is that at the beginning of the 2010s, we did find for most occupations a positive and statistically significant green wage premium. So just one word about how this is estimated. These are regular Mercer type estimates. So we control for education, for years of experience squared, for the length of the skill, the skills vector. We control also importantly for local labor market fixed effects. So these are conditional estimates that are fairly well controlled. I mean, we do not make any claim of causal identification there, but these are not just unconditional estimates in any way, shape, or form. And so those conditional estimates were, if we can just go back to the previous, thanks. Those conditional estimates were positive at the beginning of the period. And as we move to the end of the period, that green wage premium had vanished for most of these occupations. So by the end of it, we had a non-statistically significant wage premium, or even in some cases, slightly negative wage premium. One limitation of our data set is that we can't really discriminate between various possible explanations for that stylized fact. One potential explanation would be that employers do not really recognize or value green skills, and so that's why they would not command a green wage premium. A second possibility that we can actually assess with our data set is whether green jobs would have become more similar to non-green jobs over the period. So we can assess that by looking at how the skill set and skill gap difference between green and non-green has evolved over time. And we do see that skills gap has shrunk. So low carbon jobs have become more normal, if you will, more similar to non-low carbon jobs over the period. So that could be a potential explanation. A third potential explanation is that if you work in a green or low carbon occupation, then you have a bit of a halo effect in that you feel good about yourself. So you might be willing to accept a lower pay in exchange for having the impression of doing something good versus having to work for the oil and gas industry, which as you may know, have difficulty recruiting younger graduates today because of their image problem. And anecdotally, a lot of us know that we do accept a pay cut to work on climate related stuff, because as we know, environmental economics is not exactly the best paid of the subfields of economics. If we move now to the next slide, thanks. So another aspect of low carbon jobs that we can assess with this analysis is the spatial distribution of low carbon jobs. So here the unit of observation is the commuting zone. So that's essentially a spatially coherent labor market. So each of the delineation you see relate to a commuting zone. And so, of course, the darker the green, the higher the share of low carbon art in that particular commuting zone. And as you can see, we get, so these is only for low skilled low carbon ads. And we find expected spatial patterns, a higher prevalence on the West Coast, which is where the most ambitious climate policies in the US are located. Also from North Dakota, all the way through Colorado to the southern tip of Texas, we have the so-called wind corridor, which is where one of the best wind power resource in the US is located. We have a bit of the same effect around Michigan and Illinois, where around the Great Lakes, we have also a lot of wind power resource. And so you get a higher prevalence of low carbon ads. And then on top of that, we've overlaid high carbon vacancies. So essentially, we wanted to look at where those high carbon jobs that will be lost are located, whether there was some low carbon jobs being created in compensation. And actually, we found that overlap was limited. We also assessed it versus high carbon jobs, not vacancies, because of course, vacancies are just the flow of high carbon jobs. But what matters in this instance is rather the stock of low carbon jobs. And in particular, we were missing most of the coal mining by looking at vacancies because coal mining did not advertise a lot of new positions. So on the right-hand side, you see high carbon jobs, high carbon employment, confronted to low carbon jobs. And again, the overlap is limited. But more importantly, if we get to the next slide, the problem is that high carbon jobs tend to be well-paying jobs in relatively impoverished communities or counties. So it tends to be the well-paying occupation for a poorer area compared to the median level in the country, at least in the US. By contrast, low carbon jobs do not share that same characteristic. And overall, they tend to be created in areas that are already marginally more prosperous than the rest of the country. So what that means is that when the high carbon industries or sectors will be lost, the loss of revenue, loss of income for those communities will be starker than what could be compensated by the creation of low carbon jobs. And I think I'm out of time, so we'll get to the concluding slide, which is the next slide. Thanks. So in terms of takeaway messages, overall, we have not observed a increase in the overall demand for low carbon jobs over the past decade in the United States. Although in terms of composition, we do have an increase in number of low skill occupations and decrease for high skill occupations. In terms of the characterization of those low carbon jobs, they are more skills intensive than the generic counterpart. The skill gap is more pronounced in high skill occupations and for social management and technical skills. Compared to previous assessment in the literature, we find a larger and broader skill gap than previously considered. In terms of wage premium, we did find that low carbon jobs used to command a wage premium earlier on in the decade, but that has eroded over time. It has disappeared in the latter years of our sample observation. And that could be a problem moving forward because, as we say, low carbon jobs are simultaneously more intensive in skills than their generic counterpart, but they do not command a commensurate wage premium. So that might actually reduce their attractiveness to prospective job seekers. And in summary, we feel our main contribution is really this methodological contribution because we believe that's a really highly replicable tool to monitor and evaluate the consequences on the labor market of the low carbon transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Aurélien. And sorry for the technical issues and the slide issues. So I don't know how we have already a few questions in the Q&A section. So we have Corina who is asking, is there a standard method?
Yeah, I just saw that. So in practice, that's a bit of an issue in that case, and that's why. So what is standard is this choice of these 5 skills group. That's something we definitely lifted from the labor economics literature. However, to compare those skill vectors, one potential way that we did try, but ultimately felt it was not as information rich as the picture I've just shown, is to consider those shares in each of the skills group as coordinates on a vector. So that with 5 skills group, we have like a 5-dimensional vector, and then compare skill sets across occupation by taking the generalized cosine of those vectors. Thank you, Basak. Well, actually, I can answer your question just before you leave. So the reason why there's a high share of green jobs in construction and extraction is because of the construction side of the picture. You're absolutely correct that there's not a high share of green jobs in extraction, of course, but actually everything that relates to energy retrofit is in the construction side of construction and extraction as an occupation. So, and that is a core component of the green transition. And actually, anything that relates to the construction of new renewable capacity, anything that relates to the deployment of new public transportation infrastructure, that's also in the construction part of construction and extraction. So that's why it's an important green sector, so to speak. But to get back to the comparison methods for skill sets in different occupations, that's yeah, so that generalized cosine does provide you with an interesting metric, but you don't get both the intensive and extensive margin as you do with the way we've decided to label it, because with the fact that we observe both, whether you get at least one, or sorry, exactly one of those skill group and two or more, we do get that extensive margin of whether the green variant of an occupation is more skill intensive in that particular dimension than its generic counterpart. But actually in the appendix of the paper, you can still see alternative ways of measuring that skill gap. This is just like the headline figure that we used to present those findings.
And maybe to stay in this methodological area, I was wondering, you have evocated it in your conclusion, but how replicable is your methodology outside of the US? Is it a question of data availability, or, I mean, are you thinking about applying it to Europe aggregated or some countries, or, I mean, do you consider this this option, or?
Yeah, so actually, that's a very good question. In practice, the data availability is crucial, but as long as you have online job ads, this method is directly replicable. And we've already proven it because we've just completed the reproduction exercise of this very paper on UK data that we've obtained last summer. And so we've redone the analysis, the comparative exercise for the UK, and we've actually published it as a policy report just last week. You can find it on the Grantham website, on the LSE website. And in practice, the really neat thing is that we find that our findings about the skill intensity, skill gaps, types of jobs that are green more than others, all of these are really, really similar to what we found in the US. So that really leads us to believe that what we see, what we find is not US specific, but rather something more characteristic, like deeper, about the nature of low carbon jobs in and of themselves. We are going to obtain data for France and Germany relatively soon, like over the coming months. So we'll be also reassessing these in the context of France and Germany. But those are highly dependent on where Lightcast collects its data. This is very expensive data to both collect and purchase, incidentally. So the other problem is that with these non-English speaking countries, they've only started the collection process a few years ago. So we won't have 10, 15 years of data to work with, unfortunately, there. But it's better than nothing. And again, to get a cross section of low carbon jobs in a given country, if you're not interested in dynamics, you get that right away as soon as you can start collecting that type of data. And today, given the importance of online job platforms for labor markets in almost every country, that's really replicable anywhere you can scrape that data in the first place.
So thank you. Frédéric, I don't know if I can add an additional question.
I have a question, a very small question.
Yes,
I don't know, but I have a question about the reduction in the wage premium. And do you think that this reduction in the wage premium can be explained by an increase in the supply of green skills?
That could absolutely be the case. That's one of the limitations of our approach. We only observe the demand side of the labor market. We do not observe the supply side. We do know that I think, so there's possibilities in the US to get access to resume data submitted to some of the online job platforms. So that would be one way to try to assess how much of these green skills are being offered at any given time in the labor market through a sampling of those resumes. But in the present state, that's completely a potential explanation. If I had to make an educated guess, my bet would be on the halo effect, to be fair, that people accept, or rather like do not demand increased wage despite the increased skill intensity of those green jobs, because of the feel-good effect, so to speak, if you will, of working in a job that furthers the low carbon transition. Because I mean, something that we clearly do observe is the flip side of that in the high carbon sectors that really are facing big HR issues to recruit, especially younger generations. So that would be my take on it. But then again, we cannot like conclusively identify that with our data set, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks.
May I add something? Do you still have time?
Yes,
course.
please. Yeah.
Incidentally, I used to work for a EU-funded project, and we did exactly this, but in a different context. So we analyzed job ads of Slovakia, and I put in the chat in the question and answers window the link to a website that has dates. So this happened at the beginning of 2008-10. So they have data that goes very, very far behind Profesia, and he was very kind, the owner of the website, and he gave us the data. And I also put another link of my co-author, who is still, I'm not working on this anymore, but she still does. So I think it would be interesting to use your method and to contrast your results from Western Europe or the US with Eastern Europe, in which these jobs are just now emerging with the new circular economy strategies and so on. So if you can get hold on this data, I think it would be a great contribution.
Absolutely, thank you so much. That's super interesting. I mean, of course, like it is true that we are quite English-speaking country focused, because that's where most of the data collection effort is concentrated, unfortunately. But there would be startups and companies doing that data collection exercise in other languages, in other markets. So absolutely, that's extremely useful, because yeah, we could have very easily not hear about it. So yeah, thanks.
Welcome, and hopefully to see some results in the next years. That was an interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other question or
No,
comment?
I don't think so. We can stop this session and then